He hammered infant hungry into the gate and watched the wind try to erase it. They'll say I should have known better, that a man who keeps his stove lit and his cattle fed ought to see to a child's mouth. I keep telling myself that, but the truth is uglier. A father's hands are useless when the body's wired for something it cannot make. Night after night I went through the motions, warmed the bottle, checked the nipple, paced until my knees complained. The baby would curl and buck, small fists work in the air, and then he'd scream as if the world had betrayed him. Women in town offered tinned meat and polite words. None of it filled that hollow in his mouth. Pride sits heavy in a man. It sits like a coat too tight across the chest. But there was something colder than pride in that house. A choice between clinging to dignity and watching a chest stutter with hunger. I couldn't stomach the latter. The crib creaked when I leaned over. He looked at me with a kind of accusation that hurt worse than any insult. I thought about my wife, how she used to hush and hold, like she could rearrange the shape of pain. She's gone, and I have her name in my mouth like a prayer without words. So I went out in the gray and carved the sign myself on a scrap I'd used for fence repair. The letters were clumsy, honest as a boot print. I drove the nails with a force that left my knuckles sore. Each strike felt obscene and necessary, an act that made my shame visible. Neighbors'll tell you a man don't beg, and maybe they're right. But this wasn't alms, it was a summons for medicine. Milk isn't vanity, it's not charity, it's life. The idea of another woman nursing my son, of handing my failure into someone else's hands, made something near my ribs unclench. It also made something near my ribs unclench. I stepped back. The sign shook, the words flexing in the wind. Snow lay wide along the fence. The ranch house behind it was a blunt shape with a single light in the kitchen, like an offering. Through the window, the cradle showed as a darker silhouette in the glow. For a moment, the world held its breath, and I felt naked in a way I never had on Brandon Day. I tied a length of red twine to the gate so it looked less like surrender than a flare. I came in, pulled the door shut, and listened for the town to laugh. There was only the wind arguing with the wood. Then I saw a dark shape move at the tree line, slow and deliberate. It could have been nothing. It could have been a man. The nails held, the letters stayed. I stood by the stove, the baby in his blanket, and the waiting felt like a pistol in my hands.
Something knocked once, and everything inside the cabin turned toward the door. That single tap cut through the thin quiet like a bell. The baby gave a sharp whimper, and my chest went ice cold. For a moment I blamed the wind, a loose shutter, anything but a human footfall. Then the porch sighed under weight that wouldn't my own. She stood there on the threshold, soaked clear through, shawl clinging to shoulders carved by weather and worry. Cradled in her arms was a little red-faced thing, crying like it meant to split the world. Her hair was pressed to her skull, and her eyes had that hollow I recognize in folks who've learned to carry loss without letting it bend them. "May I come inside?" she asked. Her voice was rough and small, like smoke through a stovepipe. My head supplied a dozen reasons to shut the door: strangers at night, the town's tongues, the danger of letting pity turn to trouble. But the sound from the cradle cut my tidy lists up quick. I stepped aside.
She moved into the kitchen as if she belonged there by right of need, not by my permission. Up close, there was a faint, milk-sour sweetness about her, the quiet sign of recent nursing, and the thought landed like a stone. She could feed my boy. She warmed herself by the stove while I fumbled with blankets. When I asked her name, she breathed it out in a way that felt like a secret handed over. Clara. She kept stealing looks at the cradle, light on her face like moon on wire. When she said she'd lost a child last fall, fever, they said, she spoke it small, like naming a wound. When she offered to try, my chest filled with two kinds of heat, relief and the raw, ugly sting of what folks in town would say if they saw. Pride argued to the last. The baby's need argued harder. She took him with hands at once awkward and practiced, set his face to her breast, and the first suck was a thing so necessary it nearly knocked me back. The crying stilled. The room learned to breathe again. Clara's shoulders shook as tears slipped free, private and slow. She didn't look for pity. She did not want thanks. She said she had been walking roads, giving what she could, and hiding from the looks that turned generosity into gossip. She slept on the bench by the door, wrapped in my wife's old shawl. I sat near the stove until the coals went dull, watching the infant sleep against a stranger's blouse and feeling a gratitude that was almost obscene. Help had come with the price of a story, hers, and I found I owed it back by letting her stay. Dawn came thin and gray. Coffee steamed. For a moment, Clara met my look and something unread between us settled into place. Not trust exactly, not yet, but a fragile counting of debts paid. What began as a medical need had braided us together, a worried widower, a bereaved woman, and a child whose mouth was saved that night. Outside, new horse prints led away from the road toward town, single, deliberate tracks. Someone had walked the lane to see what the sign on my gate might fetch. I watched the pale light and felt the kitchen shrink into a question I couldn't yet answer.
The first suck was a quiet revelation. The crying stilled and the room learned to breathe again. There are comforts that smell like home and comforts that sound like it, but what Clara brought was neither. It was a plain, stubborn act, warm milk in a mouth that had been crying for weeks. I watched with my hands folded the way you do in church, because I didn't know which motion would be sacrilege, and saw the baby unclench into a small animal trust I hadn't known he still had. Clara's hands were awkward at first, the way midwives move when grief makes them careful. She adjusted him, murmured what sounded like old lullabies, and her thumbs skated over his cheek like a benediction. I tried not to let that make me resentful. Gratitude has its own sharpness. She told me about the last night she held her child. Fever, damp cloths, an ear pressed to a chest until the sound thinned. When she said it, her voice did not rise. She spoke as if naming it would let her carry it like a thing she could set down. I couldn't stop, she said later, when the baby slept and the house was between two breaths. After he was gone, my body kept making milk. I walked the roads because folks turned their faces the other way. Some called me a liar. I don't want coin. I don't want pity. I just can't watch another child wither. Hearing it framed like work, supply, not spectacle, changed the way I felt about the bargain between us. This wasn't a miracle to baptize with town gossip. It was labor that kept a mouthful. It made the offer practical, and that made it harder to refuse. We fell into a brittle rhythm. She fed, I mended. She fetched war, I kept watch. The first week felt like negotiation. No vows, no easy names for what we were.
Small kindnesses were currency. I fed her what the pantry could spare. She gave me the sleeping hours. Gratitude will tangle with worry. At the edge of every relief in my chest sat a question about the town, about how they'll catalog a widow with a stranger at the hearth. I could see their rules as if they were fence posts. Some you could lean on, others you could not cross. On the 6th day, while Clara held the baby with a patience that made me ache, a sound came from the lane. A wagon wheel, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the quick footfall of a passerby. It was the kind of approach folks take when they mean to bring news. We listened without speaking. The wheel's rhythm kept time toward the house and shadows lengthened on the window. Whatever it carried, gossip or assistance, would arrive soon, and the life we'd cobbled in that room would have to answer for itself.
They said she'd come for payment. She left because they promised to take what she loved. Town gnaws at small things until they're bone. At first, the talk was a hush. Whispers at the post, a glance at the market. But whispers find mouths. Claire went into town for flour and soap. She came back with fewer questions and more looks. A woman I sold beef to that morning clicked her tongue as Clara passed. The blacksmith's boy made a joke that wasn't funny. Someone left a parcel at the gate with a folded note. For the child, don't make trouble. Rumor invents motives the way men invent threats. Land, old debts, charity bought with strings. Folks began to angle their eyes like hawks over the house, measuring what shelter could be worth. Business curtsied to gossip. Credit stopped. Invitations dried. A man who'd saluted me for lending a hand at a branding turned away when Clara crossed the square. Clara fled into the smallness of her own fear. She started to flinch at passing voices, stitched her hands into work to keep 'em busy. Once, at the well, a neighbor muttered that a woman without work must be selling something else. The words cut deep because they turned grief into accusation. The parcel on the gate changed everything. It was practical, flour wrapped tight, but the note was a threat in kinder clothes. She read it and went pale, fingers wide against the paper. That night there was no sleep, only the kind of pacing that scrapes a man down to bone. She left before dawn. There was no argument, only a hastily folded note. Can't stay. They'll take him if I wait. See. Her handwriting had been pushed through like a thing wanting to escape. I opened the door to find boot prints leading off into the gray. A woman's stride, small and determined, and beside them, the tiny hollows a child's feet make. The wind had started to work, erasing edges. I saddled old Sam, the cold snapping at my face, and followed the tracks. The storm came down like a curtain, teeth of white that chewed its sight. Halfway to the ridge, I caught a shape pressed low by the barn line. For a moment, I thought I'd caught her. Then she rose, wrapped the baby close, and dipped into the snow like a shadow dissolving. My voice got thin in the wind when I called. The prints ahead blurred as if someone was rubbing them out by hand. I could have turned back, left the town to chew on its bone. I could have waited to be summoned and answer their ledgered questions. But the choice was simple in the way truth is. A child cannot wait on public opinion. I pushed into the white after him.
He rode into the storm and found two shapes pressed against an old barn, almost gone. Panic makes a man fast. The cradle was empty, the door ajar like an apology. I threw a leg over Sam and pushed into the white, meaning to follow cowardice until it led me back to answers. The tracks vanished under the first gusts, but I kept the ridge and the barn in sight until the shadows gave me what I hunted. They were there, Clara wrapped tight, the baby tucked into a shawl gone gray with weather. Their breathing was thin and sharp, small breaths like someone counting prices. I bundled them both and half-carried them to the horse, my fingers raw and clumsy with cold. The baby made a sound that slid into me, and I felt everything that had been dull light up. We rode back slow and brutal. The house reappeared through the swirl like a promise. I set them by the stove and fed the baby with what I could. Clara slept, and I watched the way her chest rose and fell, gratitude and fear braided in the slack of her jaw. Relief won't buy you peace when a town loves a story. No sooner had the coals steadied than Harrow came up the lane with 2 men in his wake. One bore a ledger, the other looked like he kept the ledger's muscle. Harrow had the look of a man who enjoyed the rules more than the people they were meant to serve. "We got notice," he said, stepping inside as if he owned the floorboards. "Claims against the property, debts unpaid, folks want their due." He glanced toward the cot like he was reading the room for value. I felt the world narrowed to the rifle propped by the door. I'd saved them from the storm, and the town wanted to take them through law and ledger. The ledger is dry paper, but dry paper will cut you if you lean on it hard. Clara woke and met my eyes. In that look she gave me the kind of request women make when the stakes are domestic and exact: hold or let go. I could see the 2 paths as clear as creek forks, one toward payment and empty hands, the other toward standing with a piece of iron and whatever that might cost us. I picked up the rifle. Its weight steadied me in ways I didn't expect. Harrow's smile thinned. "Now, Ethan," he said, as if we had all the time a town could lend, "hand over the papers." Inside, with a child sleeping and a woman half unfurling from the storm, the room waited on my answer. The ledger they spoke of was no mystery. Thomas's bill from last summer, a loan for seed that never quite came due because we had a bad year. Harrow read it like scripture, and the men behind him smelled of settled accounts and little mercy. Outside, the wind rose like a second voice. Inside, with a child sleeping and a woman half unfurling from the storm, the room waited on my answer. The next words would decide more than the house's fate. They'd mark what we were to each other now.
3 horses, a deputy's badge, and a man who refused to hand over his hearth. The thaw had only teased the ruts when Harrow rode up with the deputy and 2 men who smelled like settled accounts. They moved through my gate like they were reading from a list. "We're here about your account, Ethan," Harrow said, tipping his hat as if civility would do the taking for him. "There are claims. We'll need access to the property." Clara stood in the doorway with the child wrapped at her hip, the image of a family they'd never expected to catalog. The baby reached for the rifle leaning by the stove, fingers tapping wood with the curiosity only children get. "Not today," I said. "Read your papers inside, but you'll take no one while a child sleeps here." Harrow smiled like a man who works ledgers for sport. "Due process, then," he said. He'd planned for ink and signatures, not for witness. Neighbors began to watch from windows and door frames. In small towns, law wears whatever kindness the crowd allows. A deputy unrolled the papers, squinting at the sums, trying to make the numbers look inevitable. Murmurs threaded through the onlookers. People don't like conflict, but they don't like the sight of a rifle either. Harrow's 2 men moved like men used to making threats look casual. One of them, thin, with a quick mouth, took a step forward, as if to remind us force is sometimes cheaper than patience. My hands found the rifle stock. The weight steadied me. Clara laid a quiet hand on my shoulder. "Ethan," she said,
Not a plea, but a note of warning. Don't give them reason. I thought of the child sleeping, of the way a ledger could eat a roof, and of the town's appetite for neat resolutions. The deputy's hand hovered near his coat. I'd seen that half move before, the shrug toward an instrument and a decision not to draw it. A voice from the saloon called out that Thomas had always been square. Someone else muttered about decency. The crowd shifted like a single body drawing breath together. Harrow's smile thinned. The thin man kept coming. I counted the beat between his step and the porch and found the space thin as paper. Every second, a coin you couldn't get back. My finger found the trigger because the sight of him at the threshold was a question. Would I make a stand or hand over the house because paper told me to? The man closed the distance, the porch boards creaking beneath his boots. Everything narrowed to the space between him and the step. The deputy's hand hit his belt. A hand reached for the man's arm. I could taste the iron of fear in my mouth. He lunged.
He sanded the corners, set the cradle, and carved 3 names into the beam above the hearth. We patched the house with the same patience we fed the child. A nail here, a plank there, an argument about whether the stove needed more brick. Work kept us steady. Claire awoke with the light and hummed while she kneaded bread. The child learned to run along the fence and come back when called. Folks stopped leaving gossip at the gate. Some nodded from porches. There was a hard-bought sort of peace. But peace is a thing that can be measured, and measurement catches debt. Harrow never forgot the way ledgers balance. He came once with a polite face and papers rolled like a ribbon in his hand. He read the sums as if they were weather reports, inevitable and indifferent. I listened and felt that old animal clench, the part of me that used to trust brute labor over ink. Claire's hand found mine under the table while Harrow promised arrangements. Payment plans, he said, like a man offering coffee. Nothing unreasonable. It was the kind of generosity that smells like a cage. We were to pay in installments, to sign away corn and a share of next season's cattle returns. There was a clause tucked in, coy and sharp. The council suggested we send the boy to a nearby family for schooling. For his benefit, Harrow read. A respectable sentence, a neat solution. The wording landed in the room like a stone. The child's laugh, which had been the day's sun, felt like a fleeting thing. Claire's shoulders drew in as if to shelter an ember. I looked at the beam with the 3 names and felt them burn under my gaze. Apprenticed, Harrow said with the casual face of a man who imagines kindness masks power. Just until he is of age, he'll learn a trade. We can pay. No, Clara said, the word a blade. She stood up so fast that the chair scraped. There was something fierce in her that hadn't been for sale. Her hand tightened on the child's wrist. I wanted to be the considerate man, the one who nodded and balanced needs. But there are things you do not divide on paper. The baby is not a sum. He is a body that laughs, spits, learns. He's a name carved into my beam beside mine and hers. Harrow's smile slid. It would be for the boy's good. This town will not improve my son with its ledger. I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. It was like a tool made for the moment. People in the doorway shifted, their curiosity sharpening into something like a jury. The deputy coughed and pushed a finger into a page as if that could make the demand less hungry. Harrow's men exchanged looks, like 2 dogs deciding which one would take the bone. I set down the hammer I'd used to finish the beam. The wood smelled of sap, and the 3 names I'd carved seemed to stand up and watch. Outside, a cart creaked as it slowed at the lane. The council would not leave before the matter was settled. I could sign and lose a piece of the house, or I could refuse and risk whatever men with badges chose to enforce ink with muscle.
My mouth opened, and the words I was about to let loose would tilt us one way or another.
They planted a stubborn sapling and staked their future to something that would outlast their winters. Summer came soft after so many hard months. The child ran ahead along the fence, laughing with scraped knees and the reckless trust of small boys. Clara moved with a quiet that had learned how to keep vigil without letting the light go out. Her belly rounded. The sight of it made me feel both afraid and steadier than I had in years. We planted the tree because names in a beam could be private, but a sapling stakes a claim anyone can see. Neighbors came, the curious, the contrite, the ones who thought a planting made a story worth attending. Harrow watched from the lane and stayed there. Men with ledgers prefer that distance. We dug with hands used to mending more than vows. The child's small palms pressed into the soil as if sealing some bargain. Clara tied a strip of red cloth to the stem, and the color cut the green like a flag. I carved our 3 names into the fence post. It felt like an oath, daily labor over words, a promise the town could witness. Still, even that small ceremony didn't silence the hum of old debts, the paper that hung at Harrow's hip, the ledger's soft threat. We had patched the roof and made the stove sting less, but the county's appetite for tidy accounts had a patience I envied and feared. Planting the sapling was to make a statement, but statements sometimes invite answer. That night, the house smelled of fresh bread and the slow thing that comes when people choose to keep one another. I slept with the idea roots in my chest and woke to a knock that set every nail awake. A rider stood on the porch with a folded paper bearing the county seal. His face was polite and trimmed in business. His voice carried the sort of courtesy meant to make hard things easier to swallow. "There's a notice regarding your property's title," he said. "The council requires your presence next week." Simple words, but they unspooled into consequence. An invitation to a council could mean questions, or it could mean the beginning of the end. I saw the child's small face lift, curious at the intruder. I saw Clara's hand find mine, fingers knotting like a rope. The stamp date read 3 days before harvest. "We'll go," I said. I folded the paper with the same care I used to wrap a splint. Outside, the sapling's red cloth snapped in the breeze. Inside, with a sleeping child and a woman carrying new life, I felt the thinness between what we'd planted and what ink could unpick. The community had watched us root. Now the council would measure what size those roots were allowed to be.